everyone, it's Crystal J. Welcome back to Anti-Sermons. If you're new here, this is a podcast where we go back through the Bible and slow the story down. But instead of centering the men, we center the women. Every girl, every woman, whether she's named in the text or completely unnamed. We walk through the Bible chronologically and give sermons to the women the story barely pauses to notice. Go grab something to drink, get comfortable, settle in for a minute. And soon there will be a companion workbook for decentering and deconstruction you can follow along with while you listen. But for now, let's begin. Anti-Sermons, Episode 7, Milcah and Iscah, Genealogy and Mitochondrial DNA. Today we're slowing down over a single verse that most readers pass right by, Genesis 11:29. In one short line, two women are named Milcah and Iscah, and then just as quickly they disappear from the story. But names in the Bible are never accidental. Milcah's name means queen. Iscah's name means the one who sees, and yet neither woman is given authority, perspective, or even a voice. So in this episode, we're going to slow the text down. We're going to look at why these women are named, why they are immediately silenced, and what ancient genealogy was actually designed to do. And then we're going to compare that system with something the biblical writers never knew, the biological reality that human lineage is most reliably traced through mothers. Because sometimes the shortest verses hide the biggest questions. Anti-Sermons, Episode 7, Milcah and Iscah, Genealogy and Mitochondrial DNA. There are verses in the Bible that get lingered over. And there are verses that get rushed past. Genesis 11:29 is one of those verses that rarely gets slowed down. It's treated like background information, a genealogy verse, something you read quickly on the way to Abraham, because that's where the story is supposed to start. Here's what it says. Genesis 11:29. Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. That's it. No dialogue, no story, no explanation, just names, and then the text moves on. And by now, none of this should surprise us. We've already learned over and over again that names in the Bible are doing more work than the text often admits. So I want to slow down and look at the women this verse expects us not to notice. Let's start with Iscah. Iscah's name means the one who sees. It comes from a Hebrew root connected to sight, perception, insight. She's literally named she who sees, and yet the woman called the one who sees is never allowed to see. She never speaks, she never acts, she is never allowed to tell us what she sees. She appears once, attached to a man's genealogy, and then disappears from the story entirely. There's something deeply unsettling about that. A woman named for perception is denied all perspective. A woman named for vision is denied a voice. The text doesn't even tell us why she's there, and the silence is not accidental. That silence is doing the work. Now look at Milcah. Milcah's name comes from the same root as the word for king. Her name means queen or royal woman. And royalty is not a small thing in the ancient world. In other texts, biblical and non-biblical, royal women are treated with gravity. Queens negotiate, queens advise, queens shape dynasties, queens are remembered. But Milcah is not treated like a queen. She is treated like a connector. She is identified as a wife. She is identified as a daughter. She exists to stabilize a family line, not to shape it. She carries a royal name, but she is denied royal regard. And that contrast matters because the Bible knows how to write powerful women when it wants to. It knows how to give queens weight. What it does not do here is accidental. These women are not written as people. They are written as necessary links in a chain that does not belong to them. Iscah sees, but we are never allowed to know what she sees. Milcah is a queen, but she is never treated as one. They are named, and then the story leaves them behind. And here's where it gets interesting, because the silence doesn't just sit there. People trip over it, especially in rabbinic tradition. Rabbis noticed what the text did. They noticed what it refused to do. And when the Bible gives you a woman's name and then gives you nothing else, that creates a problem for interpreters because a name feels like it should mean something. So you start to see a kind of discomfort. Not always cruelty, not always contempt, but discomfort. The kind that shows up when tradition is built on stories and the story hands you a woman and then slams the door in her face. And what do people do when they don't know what to do with a woman the text won't explain? Sometimes they absorb her. There is a strand of rabbinic interpretation that tries to solve Iska by identifying her as Sarai. And you can almost hear the logic behind it. If Iska means the one who sees, then surely she must be someone important. Surely she must be someone we already know. Surely she must be folded in to the woman who becomes central. Because in a tradition shaped by patriarchal genealogy, an unnamed or underexplained woman is hard to tolerate. She can't just exist as a loose end. Loose ends make people nervous. So Iska gets handled. She gets placed. She gets relabeled. She gets made useful. And that move tells me something. Even when interpreters try to rescue a woman from silence, the rescue often looks like this. She doesn't get a story of her own. She gets reassigned into somebody else's story. That's not the same thing as honoring her. That's managing her. And Milcah gets treated the same way, just in a different form. Milcah isn't a mystery the way Iska is. Milcah is useful. Her name sits exactly where it needs to sit to support the family line, so she doesn't need to be absorbed. She just needs to function. And in that sense, the rabbinic response mirrors the text itself. Women either become puzzles to solve or links to file into place. And either way, the silence stays in control. And when we move from rabbinic interpretation into Christian teaching, something else happens. The discomfort fades, not because the silence has been resolved, but because it stops being noticed at all. In most Christian teaching, Iska doesn't exist. She isn't explained. She isn't questioned. She isn't even acknowledged as a problem. Milcah doesn't fare much better. If she appears at all, it's usually as a clarification, a name read quickly, a relationship noted, a detail included so the family tree doesn't feel confusing. There are no sermons about these women, no lessons. No theological reflection on why they are named and then erased. No curiosity about why the text pauses long enough to tell us their names but not long enough to let them matter. And that absence is not neutral. Christianity inherited a text already structured around male lineage, and instead of slowing down to ask what the structure costs to women, it treated the structure itself as divinely obvious. The silence was no longer something to wrestle with, it became something to accept. Where rabbinic interpreters at least stumbled over Iska and tried to account for her presence, Christian teaching largely steps past her without comment, not because an answer was found, but because the question was never taken seriously in the first place. And once silence is treated as self-explanatory, it becomes very easy to repeat it, generation after generation, sermon after sermon, lineage after lineage. Not because the text demands it, but because no one ever stops to ask why these women were named at all. This is where we have to slow down even more, because up to this point, it might sound like the problem is simply that women are forgotten, that they're overlooked, that the text just moves on too quickly. But that's not actually what's happening. What's happening is much more intentional than that. Genealogies in the ancient world were never about telling the truth of where life actually came from. They were about establishing control. They were legal documents. They were political tools. They were used to decide who owned land, who inherited power, who belonged, and who did not. Genealogies tell you who gets counted, and more importantly, who doesn't. In the ancient Near East, genealogy determined access to property, access to covenant, access to authority, access to legitimacy. And because women did not inherit land, because women did not hold legal power, because women moved between households, their bodies were necessary, but their names were inconvenient. So lineage runs through men. Not because men create life, not because men are more essential, but because men control property. Genealogy is not a record of origin, it is a record of ownership. That's why women appear the way they do in these lists, not as people with stories, not as sources of continuity, but as connectors, wives, daughters, links between male lines. This is why Iska and Milcah show up exactly the way they do. They are present because lineage matters. They are silent because truth does not. And that distinction matters because when a system is more concerned with control than accuracy, it will always prioritize power over reality. Genealogies don't ask who carried this life, they ask who gets credit for it. And once you see that, the silence around women stops looking accidental, it starts looking functional. And this is where the tension finally breaks open. Because once you see the biblical genealogies are about control rather than truth, you're forced to ask harder questions. Not about culture, not about history, but about God. If this God is truly omniscient, if this God knows all things past, present, and future, then this God would have known how life actually moves around the world. And I don't mean modern science. I don't mean microscopes or laboratories. I don't mean chromosomes or textbooks. I mean something far simpler than that. A God who knows everything would know where life actually comes from. A God who creates life would know how it continues. A God who breathes life into bodies would know which bodies carry it forward. And yet throughout Scripture, genealogy is treated as sacred, as divinely ordered, as the way identity, covenant, and belonging are passed on. And that genealogy is always traced through men. Not once does divine revelation interrupt that assumption. Not once does God pause the story to say, life does not begin where you think it does. Not once does the text slow down to honor the body that carries continuity itself. There are no metaphors, no poetry, no whispers, no hints, no language about bodies that hold generations inside them, no language about lineage being carried, not claimed. And that absence matters because this is not a case of ancient people misunderstanding biology. This is a case of divine revelation repeatedly affirming a system, blessing it, building promises on top of it, treating it as holy without ever correcting what it gets wrong. Silence in that context is not neutral, it isn't accidental, and it isn't passive. When omniscience stays quiet, silence becomes endorsement. So before we ever talk about what science has learned, before we ever name what we know to be true, we have to sit with this question. Why does a God who supposedly knows everything never once challenge a story that gives men credit for life while rendering women invisible, even in the act of creation itself? Now, this is where we stop talking about theology for a moment and let reality speak for itself, because outside of scripture, outside of genealogy lists, outside of inheritance systems, there is something we know to be true. Human lineage does not move the way these texts assume it does. Every human cell contains two kinds of DNA. One kind is mixed from both parents. The other kind is not. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down only through the mother. Not sometimes, not symbolically, always. It does not come from the father. It cannot be inherited from the male line. It is carried in the body of the woman and transmitted to every child she bears. And because mitochondrial DNA mutates very slowly, it becomes one of the most reliable tools we have for tracing ancestry. It reaches further back than surnames, further back than written records, further back than genealogies ever could. When historians lose the paper trail, they turn to it. When families lose records, they turn to it. When identities are disputed, when remains are unidentified, when crimes need to be solved, they turn to it because it remembers. Long after names are forgotten, long after documents are destroyed, long after men's lines collapse or disappear, mitochondrial DNA continues to tell the truth about where life came from. And the truth is simple. The most stable record of human lineage runs through women. Not through men's names, not through fathers' households, not through ownership or inheritance. Through mothers, through bodies that carry continuity itself, which means that while scripture sanctified male genealogy, reality preserved female truth. And that is not poetic. That is not metaphor. That is not ideology. That is fact. And this is where the irony becomes impossible to ignore. Scripture spends generations tracing male lineage, naming fathers, counting sons, recording seed as if life itself originates there. Men are credited as sources. Men are treated as beginnings. Men are remembered as origin points. Women, meanwhile, are framed as vessels, as carriers, as background, as interruptions, as problems to solve or silence to manage, and yet reality tells a completely different story. Life does not move through men the way these genealogies insist. It never has. Women carry continuity, women carry memory, women carry the record of humanity itself, not symbolically, not spiritually, but physically. While scripture preserves power, biology preserved truth. While genealogies recorded ownership, women carried origin. While men passed down names, women passed down life. And the irony is this: the very bodies the text refuses to honor are the bodies that make every lineage possible. The very people rendered invisible are the ones history cannot erase. Because even when women are not named, even when their stories are cut short, even when their lives are reduced to footnotes, their bodies remember. And that is something no genealogy, no inheritance system, and no sacred story has ever been able to control. So now we go back. Back to the women we were told not to linger on. Back to the names we were expected to read quickly and forget. Iscah, Milcah. Nothing about what we've talked about changes their place in the text. They are still silent. They are still unnamed beyond one verse. They are still denied story. But now we can finally see why they are there. They are not there because the text values them. They are there because lineage matters. Milcah matters because she stabilizes a family line. Her body connects men to men. Her name appears where inheritance needs to be clarified. Iscah, on the other hand, doesn't even get that explanation. She is named and then left unresolved. No role, no function, no justification for her presence, and that should bother us. Because when a text takes the time to name a woman and then refuses to trust her with a story, that isn't forgetfulness, that's control. Iscah is called the one who sees, and yet she is never allowed to testify to what she sees. Milcah is called queen, and yet she is never treated as someone with authority. They are present, but they are not centered, necessary but never honored, and that pattern doesn't stop with them, it moves forward. It repeats. It shows up again and again in who gets named, who gets credited, who gets remembered, and who is expected to quietly carry everything without being acknowledged. And that is where I can't pretend this is only ancient history, because I've seen this pattern play out in my own family. I was raised by my aunt and uncle, and for all intents and purposes, they were my parents. So when I say my mom and dad, that's who I mean. They raised me in the Methodist Church. They were devout Christians, and unfortunately, that also meant that they were devout believers in patriarchy. They talked about women's rights. They said women could do anything, and yet the underlying message was always clear. Men were still meant to lead, decide, and hold authority. When they got older, I was living in Kansas, raising my own family, trying to be the best Christian wife and mother I knew how to be. I knew they would eventually need help. I wanted to help. They didn't want me to. That responsibility fell on my sister. As my parents' health began to fail, my sister became their caregiver. My mother suffered a heart infarction that left her partially paralyzed. My father had serious heart problems and eventually underwent a quadruple bypass. When it became clear they would need constant care, my sister and her family sold my parents' house, built an addition onto their own home, and moved my parents in with them. She took care of everything. When they couldn't get out of bed, my sister cleaned them. She changed my father's diapers. When my mother drank too much wine and tried to walk despite being partially paralyzed, it was my sister who picked her up off the floor. My sister also handled all their finances. She realized that people were taking advantage of them in their old age, stopped the siphoning, and protected what they had left. She loved them deeply. She honored them carefully. She paid attention to the details that preserved their dignity. My mother had a single hair that would grow on her face every now and then, sometimes small, sometimes easy to miss. But my sister knew my mom hated it, so she made sure it was always plucked. She kept her nails done. She kept her hair neat. She made sure my parents were never made to feel like burdens or embarrassments. And my parents trusted her with all of it until the day they died. Because when they did, every ounce of authority was taken from her and handed to my brother. He was named the executor of the will. He was placed in charge. He was given control. My sister, who had managed their finances flawlessly while they were alive, was required to hand everything over. The woman who carried their bodies, their dignity, their care, and their daily survival was suddenly deemed unfit to carry their legacy. And I can't read Genesis anymore without seeing it. Ancient genealogies, ancient assumptions, A system that depends on women, uses women, trusts women with life, and then removes their authority the moment power is on the line. These stories may be thousands of years old, but the logic is not, the harm is not, the consequences are not. To say this didn't hurt my sister would be a fucking understatement. Why was she good enough to wipe the shit out of that man's pants, but not good enough to carry out his final wishes? Because Iscah and Milcah are not just women in Genesis, they are a pattern. Women carry the line, but men are chosen to represent it. And maybe this is the realization I keep coming back to. This God doesn't seem to misunderstand women by accident. He misunderstands lineage, authority, and care in the exact way men have always misunderstood them. He sanctifies control over continuity. He credits seed instead of bodies. He alleviates power while ignoring who actually carried the future. And when I look at my sister, when I think about who should have been trusted, who should have been honored, who should have been handed authority without question, I don't see failure. I see a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The more I read Genesis, the less mysterious it feels. This God keeps handing authority to men, while reality keeps telling a different story. Power was given to men while truth continued to run through women. Scripture sanctified male authority. Genealogies traced control through fathers. And generation after generation, women carried the labor, the bodies, the continuity without being trusted with the legacy. And then science arrived and did what Scripture never did. It told the truth plainly. Lineage does not pass through men, it passes through women, and it always has. Power was given to men while truth continued to run through women, and science, not Scripture, finally proved it. And that's today's anti-sermon. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to like, comment, rate, or review the podcast. It really helps more people find the show. And if you'd like to support the podcast financially, check out my link tree in the show notes. There are several ways you can support the show and the work that I do. You can also find me on TikTok and YouTube. I am Crystal J, Crystaljae. And remember, I'm Nice Lady.